It's March 17th, 1930, in New York City. The Empire State Building rose from a hole in Manhattan to 1,250 feet in just 410 days. 57,000 tons of steel, 11 custom-built Derricks from Duluth, Minnesota, and a supply chain so precise that a steel beam left a Pittsburgh furnace and reached its riveted position on the 80th floor in 80 hours. A contractor named Paul Starrett stood in front of investors, admitted he owned nothing useful for the job, and promised to build the tallest structure on Earth faster than any building before it. The industry rule said one worker would die for every $1 million spent. At $41 million, the math was brutal. But Starrett had a system that would change construction forever and break him in the process. This is the story of the machines that built the Empire State Building. To understand why the Empire State Building was built at such reckless speed, we need to go back 6 months. In October 1929, Severance believed he had won. His tower at 40 Wall Street would be the tallest. But Walter Chrysler had a secret. Hidden inside the Chrysler Building's dome, fabricated across 7 floors, sat a 185-foot steel spire weighing 27 tons. On October 23, 1929, one day before the stock market crashed, workers hoisted that spire from inside the building in just 90 minutes. The Chrysler Building now stood at 1,046 feet. Van Arlen watched from the street. The press barely noticed because the markets were collapsing. Across town, a former General Motors executive named John Jacob Raskob heard the news and panicked. Raskob was financing a new building on the site of the old Waldorf-Astoria Hotel at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. He was terrified that Chrysler might pull another trick, hiding some additional structure that could extend even higher. Raskob held up a pencil in front of his architect, William F. Lamb, and asked how high they could make it without it falling down. The design had already changed 15 times, from 50 stories to 86. Now Raskob demanded something Chrysler could never match. The answer was a 200-foot mooring mast, supposedly designed for docking dirigibles. Only 2 docking attempts were ever made, and both failed. The mast was not about airships. It was about height. With the mast, the Empire State Building would reach 1,250 feet to the roof and 1,454 feet to the top of the antenna. The race was over before the first steel column went up. To make this height legally possible, 2 changes to New York City's building code had to be pushed through. The allowable steel bearing load was increased from 16,000 to 18,000 pounds per square inch, signed by Mayor Walker on March 26, 1930. Elevator speed limits were raised from 700 to 1,200 feet per minute. Without those 2 changes, the building as designed could not have been built. The financing was equally aggressive. Raskob and Pierre S. DuPont led a syndicate that secured a $27.5 million mortgage from Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. When the syndicate was still short $13.5 million, a banker named Louis G. Kaufman created a complex financing vehicle through Chatham Phoenix Bank that later attracted federal investigators. Kaufman would later be called the secret man behind the world's most visible building. But the building still had to be built. Standing in the way was the Waldorf-Astoria, one of the most famous hotels in the world. It rose 16 stories and had 1,300 rooms, the largest hotel on Earth. Its demolition began on October 1, 1929, with Al Smith presiding over a somber ceremony on the roof. He declared that the historic building must come down in the northward march of progress. The structure was built from stone, marble, brick, and a fireproof steel skeleton, which made tearing it apart far slower than expected. Auctions of salvageable Waldorf-Astoria furnishings were held in late 1929. What could not be sold was loaded onto barges. Granite, bronze, lead, brass, zinc, and other materials were dumped into the Atlantic Ocean near Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Wood from the demolition was deposited in a pile on nearby 30th Street or burned in a swamp. Several of the hotel's elevators were pulled out intact and repurposed as temporary construction hoists for the new building. Their machinery relocated upward, floor by floor, as the tower climbed. Every few days, the machines had to be raised. A delay of minutes in repositioning those hoists cost hundreds of dollars. Before any steel could rise, workers had to reach bedrock. In Midtown Manhattan, that meant digging through fill, glacial till, and ancient alluvium to reach Manhattan schist, a metamorphic rock formed roughly 450 million years ago, composed of quartz, feldspar, hornblende, and mica. At the 34th Street site, bedrock sat 55 feet below grade. Workers removed approximately 57,000 tons of earth and rock to expose it. The foundation consists of 210 concrete shafts, each about 4 feet in diameter, drilled 30 to 40 feet into the schist and topped with grillages of steel beams. In a move that would define the entire project, excavation began on January 22nd, 1930, before demolition was even complete. Workers were tearing down one corner of the old hotel while drilling foundation shafts in another. This overlapping of operations, doing everything simultaneously instead of sequentially, would become Starrett brothers' signature. The first steel columns were placed on completed footings before the remaining footings were even finished. Those who have seen our documentary on the massive pile-driving machines that drive foundations into the earth know the stakes involved in this kind of work. Here at 34th Street, the stakes were multiplied by the sheer weight above. 4 central columns alone would carry a combined 10 million pounds at completion. Like and subscribe. The real story of the Empire State Building is not the architecture. It is the machines. And the most critical machine on the entire project is something that has been almost entirely forgotten. The guy, Derrick. Post and McCord, a division of American Bridge Company, operated the Derrick system that served as the project's mechanical spine. 11 Derricks in total. 9 handled structural steel. 4 were rated at 20-ton capacity and were positioned at the building's corners, and 5 were rated at 30-ton capacity for the heaviest column sections. 2 additional Derricks handled heavy machinery. Every one of them was manufactured by Clyde Ironworks of Duluth, Minnesota, the same company that built equipment for the Panama Canal and the Golden Gate Bridge. What made the Empire State Building different from every project before it was that Starrett Brothers and Eakin purchased all new, custom-designed equipment. During the bidding interview, they told investors they did not own anything that would be useful for a building of this scale. Rather than renting second-hand Santa gear, they proposed building everything from scratch and selling it after completion, crediting investors the difference. Each erection, Derrick required a crew of 9 men. The design was a tall mast, supported by cable guys anchored to the steel frame, with a boom that could swing beneath the guys to position loads. But a single Derrick could only raise steel about 30 stories in one lift. As the building climbed past its setbacks at the 23rd, 25th, 30th, 72nd, 81st, and 85th floors, the upper Derricks could not reach street level. The solution was a relay system that had never been attempted at this scale. Relay Derricks with 75-foot booms and 82-foot masts were mounted on platforms rigged out from the building's face, creating intermediate lifting stations. Steel passed from street level to a relay derrick. then up to the erecting derrick at the working floor. A chain of lifts extended the system's reach to the full 1,250-foot height of the building. The hoisting engines featured drums holding 3,500 feet of cable with band service brakes controlled by levers to govern cable speed while lowering loads. We covered how steel cables became the deadliest machines at Hoover Dam in our earlier documentary. Here at the Empire State Building, the same physics applied, but vertically, with Manhattan traffic 80 stories below. The heaviest individual column sections weighed up to 30 tons, the rated capacity of the largest derricks. When the 23rd floor setback was reached and the building's footprint began shrinking, the 4 smaller corner derricks were dismantled. The 530-ton machines continued climbing with the steel through every subsequent setback until they reached the top. 17 hoists operated on site simultaneously, feeding materials and workers upward through a building that grew taller every day. Wind was the constant enemy. At heights above the 50th floor, gusts could swing a 10-ton steel beam like a pendulum. When wind speeds exceeded safe limits, the derrick operators shut down, and the entire site waited. The structural engineer Homer Gage Balcom, nicknamed the billion-dollar man for the aggregate value of his projects, had the building outfitted with instruments to measure wind stress, wind pressure, and sway, collecting research data for the American Institute of Steel Construction. Balcom had also designed the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Center, and Grand Central Terminal. He was a Cornell-trained civil engineer and the world authority on wind stress in tall structures. He died in 1938, and the American Society of Civil Engineers established the Homer Gage Balcom Award in his honor. If the derricks were the spine, the riveting gangs were the heartbeat. 38 riveting gangs operated simultaneously during peak construction, and every one of them relied on equipment from Chicago Pneumatic, headquartered just 10 blocks away on 44th Street. Each gang consisted of 5 to 6 men working in a precisely choreographed relay that had not changed fundamentally since the first steel skyscrapers went up in the 1880s. The process began with the heater. He tended a portable coal-fired forge balanced on a wooden plank between 2 steel beams, sometimes 80 or 90 stories above the street. The air around the forge shimmered with heat, easily reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit before noon, similar to the conditions we documented in our film about the brutal reality of operating construction equipment in the 1930s. Using 3-foot tongs, the heater turned rivets in the coals until they glowed red-yellow. When a rivet reached the right temperature, the heater pulled it from the forge and threw it, sometimes as far as 50 feet, to the catcher. The catcher stood on an open beam with nothing between him and the street below, and caught the glowing rivet in a tin can. Originally, these were old paint cans. Using his own tongs, the catcher placed the red-hot rivet into a pre-drilled hole in the steel. Behind the joint, the bucker-up braced the rivet with a heavy dolly bar, and then the riveter, the gunman, drove a Chicago pneumatic hammer into the unformed end. The hammer weighed between 12 and 30 pounds, fed by compressed air hoses at 90 to 120 pounds per square inch. As the rivet cooled, it contracted and pulled the steel plates together with enormous clamping force. Experienced crews installed roughly 1 rivet per minute for larger sizes. The total rivet count across the entire building is commonly cited as 3.4 million, though the exact figure has never been confirmed by a single primary source. Workers made the most of the heat. Men reportedly placed tin food boxes on freshly riveted steel beams that were still radiating warmth, creating what they called the world's highest lunch counter. The noise was constant. 38 pneumatic hammers firing simultaneously created a roar that could be heard blocks away. Each gang competed informally with the others, and the fastest crews became minor celebrities on the site. The work ran during normal daytime hours, with no night shifts for steel erection, and a standard 5-day week, though Sundays and holidays were sometimes worked when the schedule demanded it. What happened on the ground was arguably more impressive than what happened in the sky. The Empire State Building's material delivery system was a logistics operation that would not be matched in sophistication until Toyota formalized just-in-time manufacturing decades later. The steel came from two fabricators, both subsidiaries of U.S. Steel, American Bridge Company's plant in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, 16 miles from Pittsburgh, and McClintock Marshall Company. The two firms were assigned alternating horizontal sections of the building. Together, they produced 57,000 tons of structural steel, the largest single steel order in history at that time, more than the Chrysler Building's 21,000 tons, and 40 Wall Street's 18,500 tons combined. To put that in perspective, the 102 Bucyrus steam shovels that cut the Panama Canal, which we covered in our earlier documentary, weighed 95 tons each. The Empire State Building's steel alone outweighed that entire fleet 6 times over. The logistics chain moved with startling precision. Fabricated steel shipped by rail to a supply yard on the New Jersey waterfront, then by barge to an East River pier, then by truck for the final leg to 34th Street. Each beam arrived pre-marked with codes indicating its assigned derrick, building face, floor, and exact position. Shop drawings were delivered to fabricators less than 6 weeks before the steel was due, and steel reached the erection yard just 1 week before it was needed. The structural engineers designed each level only 1 month ahead of when the order was due at the mill. At peak, between 200 and 500 trucks made daily deliveries, roughly 1 truck arriving every minute. Each truck had a scheduled slot in the delivery sequence. If a driver missed his time, he had to come back the next day. Trucks drove directly into the building through a temporary driveway created between 33rd and 34th Streets. The result was the famous claim that steel could travel from foundry roller to riveted final position in as little as 80 hours. Some accounts describe steel arriving at the site, still warm from the forge, though this likely represents peak performance rather than the daily average. Inside the building, the innovation continued. A narrow-gauge industrial railroad was installed on every floor, forming complete loops. Small mine carts, each holding 8 times more material than a wheelbarrow, distributed steel, bricks, and supplies from hoist landings to work positions with minimal human effort. The system only made economic sense because of the building's enormous floor plates, but it eliminated thousands of wheelbarrow trips every day. The brick distribution system was particularly clever. Instead of dumping bricks in the street, as was standard practice, a chute led to 2 basement hoppers, each holding 20,000 bricks, which fed the mine carts and traveled by hoist to the appropriate floor. No human hand touched a brick between delivery truck and destination. 2 concrete batch plants were built in the basement, eliminating the need for concrete mixing trucks on Manhattan's already congested streets. Daily deliveries at peak included 16,000 partition tiles, 5,000 bags of cement, 450 cubic yards of sand, and 300 bags of lime. We explored how R.G. Letourneau developed his 299 patents by finding ways to move earth more efficiently. Here, Starrett brothers applied the same principle to vertical construction, eliminating every wasted motion they could find. Like and subscribe. The elevator installation alone was the largest single order in Otis Elevator Company's history. 67 cars were originally installed, later expanded to 73. Because air currents in the building's enormous shafts could deflect standard plumb lines, the elevator rails were aligned using mine transits, surveying instruments adapted from mining engineering. 11 of the elevator cars arose higher than any previously installed, requiring newly designed, larger hoisting motors. The highest single rise was freight elevator number 1, running from the sub-basement to the 80th floor. A distance of 986 feet, over 300 elevator men worked simultaneously at peak, maintaining temporary service for construction workers while installing the permanent systems. The completed building consumed 700 million pounds of material in total. 57,000 tons of steel, 62,000 cubic yards of concrete, 10 million bricks, 200,000 cubic feet of Indiana limestone and granite, 6,514 windows, 1,060 miles of telephone cable, 70 miles of water mains, and 50 miles of radiator pipe. Only 18 different spandrel panel variations were used among 5,704 total spandrels, a deliberate simplification that accelerated both fabrication and installation. The man behind this system was Paul Starrett, 64 years old when he took the job. His career began in 1887 with the firm of Burnham and Root in Chicago during the birth of the American skyscraper. He had served as president of George A. Fuller Company, then America's largest construction firm, building over 600 structures, including the Flatiron Building, Penn Station, and the Lincoln Memorial. His brother William A. Starrett had managed all United States Army construction during World War I and had written a book called Skyscrapers and the Men Who Build Them, in which he declared that building skyscrapers is the nearest peacetime equivalent of war. The Empire State Building would prove him right. The firm won the contract with a $500,000 fee. Their management innovations were the invisible engine behind the project's speed. Fast-track construction, beginning building before design was complete, was applied at this scale for the first time in commercial construction. Design ran just 1 month ahead of fabrication orders. Architect Richmond Shreve later described the approach as a great assembly line. Only the assembly line did the moving, while the finished product stayed in place. When a supplier could not deliver dark Hauteville marble on schedule, Starrett Brothers did something almost unheard of for a construction contractor. They purchased an entire quarry in Germany to supply Rose Formosa marble as a substitute. The project would not wait for anyone. To keep 3,400 workers productive, Starrett placed cafeterias on 5 incomplete floors: the 3rd, 9th, 24th, 47th, and 64th, so workers would not have to descend to street level for lunch. Temporary water taps were installed at various heights for the same reason. A team of inspectors visited every part of the project multiple times daily, consolidating data into summary reports presented to Superintendent John W. Bowser within hours. This was essentially real-time project tracking, decades before computerized construction management. The peak single-day workforce was 3,439 workers on August 14, 1930, spread across 60 different trades. The breakdown that day included 328 arch laborers, 290 bricklayers, 384 brick laborers, 225 carpenters, 107 derrick operators, 105 electricians, 249 elevator installers, 194 HVAC workers, 192 plumbers, and 285 steel workers, plus clerks, foremen, inspectors, and water boys. One of those water boys was Joe Carbonell, just 16 years old, who carried buckets across open beams. He later recalled that it was kind of a thrill working on the beams, and that he learned to never look down, just look to the end of the beam. Total project labor reached 7 million man-hours across those 60 trades. Work proceeded during normal daytime hours for steel erection, with a standard 5-day week, though the foundation phase ran 24 hours, with 2 12-hour shifts of 300 men each. Among those workers walked the Kahnawake Mohawk Ironworkers, men whose tradition in high steel traced back to 1886. That year, the Dominion Bridge Company hired men from the Kahnawake Reserve near Montreal as laborers on a St. Lawrence River Railroad bridge. A company official later recalled that the Mohawk men would climb into the spans and walk around as cool and collected as the toughest riveters on the crew. Training as rivet workers began as young as 12 years old. But the tradition carried a scar. On August 29, 1907, the south arm of the Quebec Bridge collapsed in 15 seconds, killing 75 workers. 33 of them were Kahnawake Mohawk men, from a community of only 1,600 people. The youngest was 18. The eldest was 44 and left behind a pregnant wife and 11 children. 4 family names ceased to exist that day. Steel from the collapsed bridge was brought to Kahnawake and fashioned into memorial crosses marking the graves. In the Mohawk language, the disaster is called Shontosquena. It means when the bridge fell. Afterward, the women of Kahnawake insisted that ironworkers would spread across different projects in small groups, so no single catastrophe could again destroy the community. By the 1930s, a thriving Mohawk community of roughly 700 to 800 people had settled in Brooklyn's North Gowanus neighborhood, known as Little Kahnawake. Men rented rooms in buildings where, for many years, there was a Mohawk name on every buzzer. Their social center was the Wigwam Room Bar, which bore a sign reading "The greatest ironworkers in the world pass through these doors." At nearby Chrysler Presbyterian Church, Pastor David Monroe Corey learned the Mohawk language and delivered sermons in it during the 1940s and the 1950s. No primary source gives an exact count of Mohawk ironworkers on the Empire State Building, but sources consistently describe them as a sizable minority of the ironworker force, filling roles in both rivet gangs and raising gangs. They reportedly spoke their native language on the steel. Like and subscribe. The official death toll for the Empire State Building construction is 5 to 6 workers plus 1 civilian. In an era before hard hats, safety nets, harnesses, or fall protection of any kind, this number is astonishing. The industry rule of thumb in 1930 held that 1 worker would die for every $1 million spent. At $41 million total cost, the project should have killed 41 men. The documented dead include Giuseppe Tedeschi and L. De Monanichi, both laborers killed on January 31st, 1930. Reuben Brown, an ironworker, was killed in May of 1930. Sigus Andreasen and Frank Sullivan, both carpenters, were killed in July of 1930. And A. Carlson, a carpenter, died on December 9, 1930. Causes included falling from scaffolds, being struck by trucks, falling down elevator shafts, and being hit by hoists. 1 worker was killed by a blast. A colleague later recalled "Poor Denny, rammed dead by a derrick and falling in my arms." The civilian killed was Elizabeth Eager, a pedestrian on 34th Street, struck by a broken plank dropped by an ironworker. She died of blood poisoning from the ankle wound. The New York Daily News reported 14 deaths. A socialist magazine called The New Masses claimed 42. The official count may reflect incomplete records for undocumented immigrant workers or those who died later from their injuries. OSHA would not exist until 1970. The only applicable regulation was New York's 1910 Workers' Compensation Law, which set fixed rates for injuries, but imposed no prevention requirements. No hard hats were required, or commonly worn. Lewis Hines photographs consistently show bareheaded workers at extreme heights. Edward Bullard had patented the hard-boiled hat in 1919, but the first major project to require head protection was Hoover Dam in 1931, the same year the Empire State Building opened. There were no safety nets. Those would first see wide use on the Golden Gate Bridge from 1933 to 1937, where a safety net saved 19 men, who became known as the Halfway to Hell Club. The workers on the Empire State Building had nothing between them and the street below except their own judgment. For comparison, the Chrysler Building recorded 0 fatalities. The Brooklyn Bridge killed 27 to 30. Hoover Dam killed 96. The World Trade Center killed 60. The speed of construction remains unmatched. Steel erection began on April 7, 1930. By June 20th, the frame had reached the 26th floor. During July of 1930, 22 stories of steel were placed in 22 working days. Architect Richmond Shreve himself stated that at peak, they erected 14.5 floors in 10 working days, including steel, concrete, stone, and all concurrent trades. The average sustained rate was 4.5 stories per week, surpassing the previous record of 3.5 stories per week for comparable buildings. The steel frame topped out at 1,048 feet on September 19, 1930, just 23 weeks after the first column, 12 days ahead of schedule. On April 11, 1931, 410 days after construction began, former New York Governor Al Smith drove the final rivet. It was made of solid gold. 20 days later, on May 1, 1931, President Herbert Hoover pressed a button in Washington, D.C. to turn on the building's lights for the first time. The Empire State Building was the tallest structure on Earth, but the building opened 75% empty. Only about 20 tenants occupied space. Everything above the 41st floor sat vacant. Building managers left lights on in empty offices to create an illusion of occupancy. The nickname Empty State Building first appeared in print on March 28, 1932. By 1935, occupancy was just 23%, while the Chrysler Building had reached 70%. The building lost approximately $1 million per year through the mid-1930s. The total cost, including land and demolition, came to $40,948,900, roughly $690 million in today's money. Construction alone cost $24,718,000. The original budget had been $60 million, meaning the project came in roughly $19 million under estimate. The savings came almost entirely from the Depression's collapse of material and labor costs. Workers earned approximately $15 per day, about $1.25 per hour for 12-hour shifts. Union ironworker wages had fallen from $1.37 per hour before the crash to about $1.05. Weekly payroll still approached $250,000. The depression that devastated the building's rental market had made its construction cheaper than anyone expected. What saved it was the observatory. 1 million visitors in 1931, each paying $1 admission, generated approximately $2 million in revenue, equal to total rental income. By 1938, observatory revenue exceeded $1 million annually. The observatory kept the building financially viable through its worst years. Full occupancy did not arrive until World War II, when government agencies and defense contractors filled the floors. In 1951, the building sold for $51 million, a record for a single structure. On September 10, 1930, Al Smith laid a cornerstone containing the previous day's New York Times, a complete United States currency set of every denomination minted in 1930, a history of the site, and photographs of everyone involved in construction. By the time the building finally turned a profit, most of those people had moved on or passed away. The toll on the builders was severe. Paul Starrett wrote in his 1938 autobiography, Changing the Skyline, that the strain of erecting the Empire State Building in 11 months was too much for him, and he suffered a rather severe nervous breakdown. He blamed his brother William's death in 1932, at age 55, on overwork related to the project. Starrett Brothers and Eakin filed for bankruptcy in 1935. as the Depression killed private construction. The firm did not turn a profit again until 1946. The official photographer, Louis Hine, was 55 years old when hired in the spring of 1930. Using cameras with no safety equipment, he was swung out in a specially designed basket 1,000 feet above Fifth Avenue and dangled from derrick cables. He called the Ironworkers his Sky Boys and produced nearly 1,000 negatives over 6 months. His most famous image, titled Icarus atop Empire State Building, hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. After the project, Hine's career collapsed. Rejected by Life magazine and the Farm Security Administration, his wife died in 1939. He lost his home to an unpaid mortgage, and he died on November 3, 1940, essentially destitute. The man who documented the most spectacular construction achievement in American history could not afford to keep his own house. The 11 Clyde Ironworks Derricks were likely sold at a loss during the Depression, joining the firm that purchased them in financial ruin. The Chicago pneumatic hammers went back to 44th Street. The narrow-gauge railroad tracks were pulled up and scrapped. The coal forges that heated 3.4 million rivets were dismantled and forgotten. The machines that built the Empire State Building, like many of the men who operated them, served a singular purpose and then disappeared. Today, the Empire State Building still stands at 34th Street and 5th Avenue, 95 years after Starrett's workers broke ground. The Derricks are gone. The riveting gangs are gone. The narrow-gauge railroad exists only in Louis Hine's photographs. But every one of those 1,250 feet rests on the work of machines and men who achieved something that has never been repeated. 410 days, 57,000 tons of steel, and a system so perfectly engineered that modern construction still cannot match its speed. The next time we look up at that skyline, we might remember that the tallest building in the world was built by men who had no hard hats, no safety nets, and no second chances. They had steel, steam, and nerve, and somehow that was enough. Like and subscribe